The tools are there to support us. And I think that's really sort of how we as sales leaders need to think about tools. I think, great sales skills are independent of tools.
Hello Sales Nation, I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast. If you haven't already, make sure you download Tucker Max's episode, which was aired yesterday. He disagreed with a whole bunch of things I said, but as a CEO of a company actively hiring salespeople at the moment, he had some really unique insights. And on with today's episode. On today's show, we have James Pember, CEO of Sparta Sales, which is a sales gamification company. And we're talking about software, gamification, of course, and a whole lot more. You can find out links for everything that we talk about in the show notes over at salesman.red. And with that all said, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, James, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Will.
You are more than welcome. We're going to dive into one of my favorite topics today, which is software and the evolution of sales, because a lot of the changes that are happening, whether it be social, whether it be just through the internet, are happening because of software, and there's massive implications there looking forward. Of course, I think we're going to dive down some rabbit holes. I think there's going to be some conversation of motivation and psychology and all of this as well, I'm sure. But massively leading question to start the show, as most episodes start, for the B2B sales professional listening to this show now, are software tools, sales enablement tools, we'll talk about your platform later on perhaps in the show as well, CRMs, are they a distraction or are they integral to sales in 2016?
I think it's a great question. I think, first off, I think the tools are there to support us. And I think that's really sort of how we as sales leaders need to think about tools. I think, great sales skills are independent of tools. Obviously, tools can be used to enable, they can be used to sort of enhance, but they don't replace skills. But I also think, there is such a thing as tool overload. And if I'm really honest, I think we've had a little bit of it internally in our team. So we're about 2 years old now. So we've obviously been through a few iterations of our sort of sales process. And I think, we had one sort of period, about 6 months ago where we had too many tools. There was too many things to interact with. So I think it can be distracting. I think when you look inside a sales organization, if you ask any sales leader and you ask them to sort of, pick out your best performing rep, I think that the reasons for them being the best are nothing to do with tools. So I think we obsess over tools. I'm a bit of a tool junkie as well. I love software, I love processes, I love optimizing workflows. But when I look out on the sales floor, the best guys and girls, it's independent of the tools. The phone is the tool, right? However, I do think, just to sort of circle back, I do think that, when we look at tools as enablers and sort of support aids, that can obviously be super effective. I'm thinking prospecting, easier sort of data entry into a CRM, obviously sort of gamification where we're working in. I think when you view them as support, that's where they're most effective.
Why, and we can perhaps dive into the psychology of this a little bit, and I'm sure we only scratch the surface, but why are we obsessed with tools, to use your words, James?
Well, I think what happens as sales leaders is we look, when things aren't going well, we look to blame it on the process. We look to blame it on the tool set. We look to find gaps in our process, and we look to find solutions to those gaps. So we think, let's give it like a really simple example. We think activity levels, which is obviously something most sales teams struggle with. How do we get more energy and how do we get more sort of inputs into the top of our funnel? For us in B2B, that's obviously appointments or demos or meetings or whatever it might be. And I think, in the case of prospecting, we think, okay, so we're not booking enough meetings. We're obviously not good enough at prospecting. Let's buy a prospecting tool. Let's buy a sort of email outreach tool. Let's buy a dialer. Let's buy lists. And that's all good if, you think that the core problem are those tools, whereas my gut feeling is the core problem is probably motivation. It's probably work ethic. It's probably attitude. You don't need tools to book meetings. You need phone numbers and you need a phone. But So when those problems arise, we look to the tools, and I'm definitely guilty of this myself. You find problems and you look for quick, easy solutions. You want to buy your way out of the problem. Whereas I think sales isn't rocket science, right? It's about attitude, work ethic, and inputs. And I think that's why we become so obsessed with tools. We look for solutions and we look to pay our way out of these problems.
And has this always been the case, that sales is clearly about your sales skills, your attitude, your motivation? Is this a new thing, do you think, that we're now buying software and tools and hacks and training and all this kind of stuff? And is this a new thing with the onset of the internet and software being more ubiquitous and was being used to it? Or do you think 40 years ago, I don't even know who, IBM are having the same problems and the same conversations then as well?
Well, I don't know, obviously, because I started selling, post-internet or, in the internet times. But my gut feeling is that this could be a new thing. I think this sort of tool overload definitely seems to be a new thing. Even 10 years ago when I started, there were sort of less tools in the process. That doesn't mean it was better. I think there were obvious gaps and there were obvious pain points. Where I had to go through the yellow pages to get phone numbers, for example. That's obviously not optimal. But
having said that, because there's two ways of looking at this. There's one that more and faster is always better. But if you, and I'm only playing devil's advocate here, if you have to look through the yellow pages to find someone's number, you are only going to do that for someone that you think is pre-qualified, that you've got a good chance of getting in touch with and having a conversation with. Because I think there's a problem at the moment where salespeople are trying to act like marketers have done and are learning the problems with it, of just spamming out as much as possible, not customized emails. And that's the cliche obvious example. But do you think that it was a problem that you had to look in the yellow pages, because it probably narrows your focus down?
It's a good point. And I think in some ways, like this, this predictable revenue, sales development, there could be an argument that that's turned us into sort of like spray and pray, spray and pray type people, where we just sort of, get out and sort of pull the nets in and see what we catch. I must admit, I'm a fan of that sort of sales development model, because I do think it makes it easier for sales reps. They obviously get more sort of inbound requests via those replies. But then again, I think you have a point as well, where I think, the best sales reps are probably more focused and more targeted. They obviously build relationships, they generate referrals, they don't sit in the yellow pages and pull numbers out. So I think you might be right. I think, there could be a big downside to this sales development trend, which is that we've become very much about quantity, not quality, which obviously in sales is never going to work in the long run.
Mm-hmm. And of course, it's product specific, it's probably industry specific as well. If you are selling, I don't know, some kind of boutique, really expensive or antique vase, clearly you're not going to spam 100 people on LinkedIn who've mentioned that they like vases. I don't know, maybe you would, but I'm sure a trip through the yellow pages and looking at individual traders and all that kind of thing would be a better way to go about it. So I appreciate that, and I think that's important to note. And before we get any further, because I want to talk about motivation and that side of things, what did you keep and what did you ditch in your own company software wise? And you don't need to go into names and or anything like that perspective, but what worked and what didn't?
Yeah, well, I mean, and this is a perfect segue from the last question. So we actually, without going into the details, we've actually sort of almost ditched the sort of the cold email strategy. We're very much more focused on the phone now. I think there are sort of advantages that we have, given we have such a niched product. We do have a very clear value proposition, which means if we can get the right person on the phone, we can communicate that value within a couple of minutes. So we've sort of ditched that sort of that sales development type outreach, and we've moved much more to what could be considered more old school, which is sort of prospecting and picking up the phone. That's not to say we won't go back at some point. There are the whole Aaron Ross predictable revenue model, it's proven to work. But I do think, again, the sort of the quality over quantity sort of argument comes into play there. So we've ditched outbound sort of email and gone more to the phone.
And when you say that, have you completely ditched it, or have you just shifted focus slightly? And I'm intrigued here because I see this, and I'm no expert in any of this, and the guests know this. I bang on that I'm not an expert, not a guru, but I'm speaking to enough experts and gurus every single day that there seems to be a trend and a split in the road of big corporates are looking for that predictable revenue model. Of course, it seems like the Holy Grail. If you've got shareholders, if you're a public company, that's what you need, really. And it's probably fine to have a less effective model that is proven and scalable versus for perhaps a smaller company like you, if you can motivate and get your team hustling and get them really and working and maximizing their time. Because, and again, I don't know much about this, but I imagine wages is one of your biggest overheads. Optimizing the time versus in accordance with their wages is probably a bigger win for you than being able to say, well, in 18 months' time, I know we're going to hit this marker, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, another one of the big downsides of the sort of the outbound emailing model is that, it can lead to a little bit of laziness in the sales reps because they send the emails out and they wait for responses. We prefer a much more sort of proactive approach where sort of we know who we want to work with. The benefit of sort of, when you have a very niched product is that it's very clear who the ideal customers are. We have our ICP, ideal customer profile. So, why would we wait for them to email us? Let's just call them. We're not calling and selling vacuum cleaners. We have a genuine valuable product. So for us, it's just about, let's be proactive. Let's go and talk to the people that we need to talk to. Like you say, I think at scale, that predictable revenue model potentially, I would say definitely has a lot of big advantages. You can obviously scale outreach. You can contact 100 people per day as opposed to 20. But for us, it's much more about being proactive, and that's also one of the things about being a small company. We don't have time to wait. When we tried that model, it did work. But obviously, sort of, people saved the email. We found, people were saving the email and coming back to it 6 months later and being like, well, I saved your original email. It is actually an interesting time. But as a small company, you just don't have time for that. You need to be much more proactive.
And what did your sales team think when you made that shift? Were they annoyed? Because clearly the stereotype, it doesn't bother me, but I know it bothers a lot of the listeners that they hate they use that word, they hate cold calling. And I'm not saying that you're cold calling. It seems that you're doing a lot of qualification before that, which in my mind changes the scenario around quite a bit. But what was the attitude like to this shift?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned something interesting there. Cold calling definitely is less effective. I mean, I think I've even tried to make the argument before that it's not, but of course it is. What you need to do is you need to turn it from sort of cold to lukewarm, which is obviously sort of qualification, social selling, like all those sorts of things. Then I think, we've just tried to instill an attitude, in our team that we're a small company and we're trying to grow quickly. And this is the best way for us to get out into the marketplace. So, thankfully, we're at the stage where everyone's really engaged. We're a team of 16 people today, so we're not obviously a big corporation. So it's easy for us to sell that message in that, this is what we need to do every day. We need to grind and we need to pick up the phone. I imagine, though, trying to achieve that at IBM or Microsoft, that's totally a different proposition. There, I'm positive you'll get a lot of pushback. And they'll be looking for sort of the path of least resistance. But that's normal as well. That's part and parcel of running a big company, I guess.
So how do we then leverage... let's take a step back. How do we know what software tool is going to be useful? Is this a case of trial and error, or is it to go down the minimalist approach of we need a CRM, we need some kind of email tracking, we need some kind of motivation tool, and that's it? Or do we need to just be throwing as many tools into the pot and seeing what works as possible?
Yeah, no, we definitely encourage dropping or dripping tools in slowly. I think the other thing about sort of sales tools is they can be quite disruptive to someone's sort of day or their process. Salespeople, as much as people don't think salespeople are organized, and maybe they're not the most organized people, but they are quite methodical, or at least the good ones are. Mm-hmm. So I think if you disturb that sort of process by making them sort of jump through hoops just to do sort of the basics of their job, especially the good ones, right? Because the good ones understand they just need to get on the phone or get in front of a customer, and that's how they succeed. So if you add too many sort of hoops, obviously that's going to be sort of really disruptive. So I agree. I think start with a sort of minimalist stack, and then obviously bring tools in for very specific problems.
And what would be in that stack? That's what I'm intrigued as to here, James, because for me, last company I worked for, $1 billion+ dollar company, privately held. We didn't even have a CRM. It's like this is the market leader in endoscopy and urology and a bunch of other some divisions. We didn't have a CRM. We didn't have any email tracking. We were all using Outlook. I don't think we really had, in hindsight, we didn't have anything. I used my own CRM to track everything, and that went from spreadsheets to I think I ended up using Pipedrive at the end of things, just so I could keep on top of what was going on.
Yeah, and I think definitely there are a couple of basics. I think CRM is an obvious one. I think let's call it sort of email tracking, something in that space. Basically, sort of you want to keep an eye on, obviously, what your prospects are doing. There's a couple of different variations. There's document tracking, email tracking, all those sorts of things. I think you need that. You definitely need a simple way to sort of track the funnel. So, some CRMs are good at handling that, others aren't. But you need some way of understanding what is our sales process? And I think I'm amazed at how many companies don't actually understand their process. You as a leader, you need to be able to ask someone, hey, how many demos have you conducted in the last 5 days? And what percentage of those have converted to offers? I mean, you don't need to know off the top of your head, obviously, but you need to be able to get that number without a pivot table in Excel. You need to just have that number.
And whose responsibility is that, James? Is it for the individual salesperson so that they have got a number to improve on personally, or is this top down? And because a lot of the CRM stuff that people have had to do and I had to do in other companies was so that the CEO had a load of data and it wasn't really useful for us. So whose responsibility is things of that nature? Is it the salesperson or sales leadership?
Well, I think ultimately there's value to both, right? I think like sales leadership need to know or need insight into sort of the metrics and the funnel in order to sort of coach and support more effectively. But the power of giving a sales rep insight into how they can improve, and we've built a whole product on that concept, which we can go into later. But giving people a clear understanding of like, what is it that I'm doing well, what is it that I'm not doing well, and what do I need to do to improve? Like that's the easiest way to improve performance. I mean, sometimes I meet big, like I said, $1 billion companies, and I just say, get everyone to get a pad and a pen on their desk and just literally sort of mark everything that they're doing. Often that, with no software or no technology, that can be an easy win in itself. Because
let's get really practical here. Sorry, I keep interrupting you, but sure. I want to keep it narrow and focused in that. So someone listening to this show right now, perhaps they're driving to the next sales meeting and they've got an opportunity to do some of the stuff that we're talking about, to track some metrics. What should they be tracking day to day?
So for B2B, it's easy. You just track the stages of the funnel, right? So everyone's got a slightly different funnel, but what we do internally is we do sort of calls, or sort of, we call them pickups. So every time you actually pick up the phone, regardless of whether someone answers, or whether you hit the receptionist or whatever, you've actually got to have a sort of a clear understanding of how many times have I tried to reach someone today. We track conversations. So the right person picked up that phone and spoke to you. Doesn't matter if it goes anywhere or not. Booked appointments, conducted appointments, sent proposals, and closed deals. Like, I think if you have those, I think it was 6 things. That's a massive step forward. And like, I promise you, I think I meet 100 VP sales per month. Like, not many are doing that. And they can, like you said, they can be sort of $1 billion publicly traded companies, and they have no idea what's actually happening on the sales floor. They know the results, obviously. They know sort of, have people hit their budget? What bookings, what are they at in bookings? They very rarely understand, what are the inputs, and we're big here on, actions drive outcomes. So too many companies track outcomes and they say, we need to double our sales number. How the hell am I going to do that? And that's obviously where you need to start with the actions. And again, most companies don't know this. Most sales reps don't know this. And that's when, sales reps get confused. They're not sure how to improve. That's normally what I sort of put as a first step. Just pen and paper. Like, it doesn't have
Why
to be...
don't we know this, James? Because it seems, and I've not got no sales management experience. I've got no sales leadership experience. So clearly there's a lot of other things that go on other than just motivating your staff. For the sales manager, perhaps there shouldn't be other stuff going on. Perhaps that should be your role, to just motivate. And clearly tracking some of these things are going to be tools to motivate them. But why aren't we tracking all this stuff? Because it seems so simple from the outside looking in.
No, I know it's not hard. Well, I think two things are sort of, one, salespeople just, it's such a cliche, don't like data entry. So I think, the incentive for a sales rep to go and enter, a phone call into the CRM, it's just so low because there's no reward attached to that. They see no long-term benefit in doing so. So the incentives for actually giving up this information, whether it's for yourself or for your manager, they're just so low because they've never been used in a way that they perceive as useful to them. So they just think, well, why should I even bother? Why does it matter? As long as I hit my number. And the sales managers are at fault here, right? Because we only measure and reward end results. So we say, guys, it doesn't matter how you get there. You just need to hit your budget. Like, that's what every sales manager says. We need to make our number. But that's a very average way of trying to change behavior or improve results. You need to look at actions. So that's the first one. I think the incentives with the CRM. And then two, I think, like I said, most teams just don't have a culture of sort of understanding the importance of activities. Even if we can articulate it, every manager knows that we need to do our activities, having that as part of the culture. And, I've met some companies recently that have gone as far to actually build activity levels into their compensation, which is pretty drastic, like I'll admit. And even for us, that's pretty drastic. But I think there's something there where, I use the example often that if you're a sales rep and you miss your number at the end of the month, but you actually completed all of the activities that you were meant to do, I actually think you can hold your head pretty high. If you miss your number and don't hit the activity numbers, obviously then it's your own fault. So I think, companies need to start tracking these things. It doesn't have to be complicated. Because that in itself is going to drive a lot of insight, but then obviously starting to also sort of motivate, reward and incentivize those things as well.
And how do we do that? Because that seems like the crux of the whole conversation here and I hate to dumb it down, but I'm dumbing it down so that I can contemplate it in my own mind, never mind the listeners or anyone else. Because I always think if I can understand it, everyone else can. It seems like there's huge benefits to understanding your calls to conversions, to books, to proposal sent to proposal closed. That makes total sense to me. Why or how do we motivate, and perhaps not talking about sales management here, talking about individuals.
Yeah.
How do we motivate ourselves personally to want to put that data in so that we can improve from it? Because I'm very data oriented myself. My background is in, as you'll know, James, and most of the audience will know by now because I bang on about it all the time. But I've got a degree in chemistry. My background is in data, in science. And so I think it was Peter Drucker who said something along the lines of what you measure improves.
He said what gets measured gets done, and what gets rewarded gets repeated. It's the classic line. I think Drucker was like the godfather of management consulting, and that's I'm glad you brought that up because that's something that I actually I use that line a lot, and I think we've obviously built a business on this concept of, how do we get people to care about their inputs? And we think, now I don't want to talk too much about our own product, but we think that gamification is a very interesting way to do that. Because again, if you remember what I said before, is the biggest problem is there is no incentive today for a sales rep to measure calls, meetings, appointments, because what's the reward? There's certainly no financial reward, but inside a sales organization today, there's no reward of any kind. No one comes and gives you a high five and says, "Dude, great job for booking that call." So I understand. I wouldn't do it either. So what we've tried to do is build a platform where you're rewarded for doing that. So to just go into what we do slightly, I don't want to go too deep.
You feel free to jump into it, James, because sure. I wouldn't have you on the show if I didn't want you to talk about some of this stuff.
Sure.
Because I think what you're doing is important, because you're surpassing that, well, I need money to buy that nice Porsche. And you're diving into the deeper, almost belief systems that people have, and you're diving into the internal competitive nature. And of course, most salespeople are competitive. So, genuinely feel free to dive as deep as you want, mate.
So I'll give a little bit of a brief pitch, because it's actually very related to what we're talking about. So in its most simplest form, our product Sparta is a sort of a web-based platform which lets you create campaigns where you focus and reward certain activities. So that can be everything from what we're talking about: calls, meetings, appointments. It can also be as crazy as or as far-fetched as, we have companies that, give points for standing instead of sitting at your desk. So it's really sort of a behavior change platform. So what we do is we let a company set up a competition or a campaign, and we say, hey, for every call, you get 1 point. For every time you book an appointment, you get 3 points. For every time you conduct an appointment, you get 10. If you send an offer, you get 20. And if you close it, you get 50. And whilst, this is not an uncommon thing inside a sales team. Competitions are very, very widespread. What we've done, though, by doing this is we've attached an incentive to entering the data or giving up the data. So instead of before, when most teams run competitions, they say, hey, whoever closes the most revenue this quarter gets a trip to Hawaii, which actually never changes anything, because the same person that would have won anyway has won. What we've done is we've actually made it very clear that, every single little input, whether that's a phone call, a conversation, an appointment, a proposal, or a deal, there's a reward for that. And this all happens on an almost subconscious level, because what happens is salespeople are very insecure. As much as they're very brash and cocky, they also love pats on the back. They love to be recognized, which is why we do things like we put people up on the wall as salesperson of the month. It's why we do competitions. It's very much in their DNA to want to be recognized. So what we do is we recognize people for doing a good job, whether that's picking up the phone or closing the deals. So again, we've attached an incentive or a reward for entering this data. So to go all the way back to the start of the conversation, what that does is it provides insight. And now suddenly people understand, I'm down the bottom of the ladder here, but it's because clearly I'm not picking up the phone as much as, John, who's in number one. So it just makes it very obvious. Like, it's very simple. It's not complicated, but it just makes it very obvious. Like, why am I where I am? And what are the people better than me doing that I'm not? And obviously, what are the people underneath me not doing that I'm doing? So it makes it very clear, it makes it very transparent. And most importantly, it actually rewards people for doing the hard work, because, the end result, closing a deal is just the result of good work, 4 steps down the ladder. Generally B2B sales, I don't want to generalize too much. Generally B2B sales is about inputs and effort. I know we spoke about quantity and quality before, but generally speaking, if you can pick up the phone more times, go to more appointments, get more offers out, you will close more business.
Is that a fact, James? You might have data on this, or you might have you might have seen data on this, but I don't know if it's ever been studied. It'd be an interesting study if it has. is there any data that unequivocally shows that quality doesn't outdo quantity, and number of dials perhaps is more important than quality of dials?
Well, I think I saw one interesting sort of infographic this morning. I can't remember what the company was, but they pointed out something very interesting related to this, which is that most salespeople have roughly a similar hit rate. So between 15 and 30% seems to be the span. If that is the case, then we know that within reason, if we add more opportunities to our pipeline, we will close that similar sort of amount. So if we will close 30% of our opportunities, if we add 10 more, we should close 3 more. Obviously, this is all not hyper accurate. If you put shitty opportunities into your funnel, it's not going to happen. But if you within reason, if you're following a similar sort of quality control process, adding more opportunities should lead to more business. Yes.
And the reason I ask is that I've had other people come on the show before. It seems almost it seems like it should work, but also seems counterintuitive. And I don't know, the answer is it depends. And I think it'd be really interesting to have, and this probably can't even happen in the real world because of the opportunity cost of it. But if you could split a sales team in two, have one, incentivize them for number of percentage closed versus number of dials, so that they're only interacting with people that are highly pre-qualified. I imagine that they would be highly motivated because they know they're not going to be rejected and all these kind of things that wear down salespeople over time. And then if you motivate the other team of both number of closes and initial kind of contact points, I wonder who would come out on top. Who do you think would come out on top if that was the situation?
Oh. That's actually a great question. I think I've got to be really boring and say it still depends, though, because I think, that's a great question. I think the problem is in sales, we kind of have to do both, or we have to.
You're on the fence here, James. Go on.
Yeah.
One way or the other. You've got a gun to your head in this weird, fake, imaginary scenario. Yeah. And you've got to go one format with your sales team, one way or the other. Which way would you go?
I'm gonna go with percentage hit rate, or percentage of opportunities closed. Simply because I do agree, and we talked about it already. I do think that chasing volume endlessly isn't the right way, but I think, adding volume and because I don't think it's binary, right? I think if you're a sales rep that handles 8 opportunities per month, if you handle 12, then I think you will add 1 or 2 extra deals per month. If you obviously add another 12, yeah, sure. No, then suddenly you'll be diluting your time. You won't be able to give every opportunity the time that they need, etc. So I think clearly there's a balance in the middle somewhere.
Sure, interesting. And I guess this is where the line. Thank you. This is where the line blends between art and science, I guess. And I've got one final question for you, James, before we get onto the questions I ask everyone that comes on the show. And you mentioned this kind of before. You alluded to it, and I'm intrigued to how software and your software in particular could perhaps help or change this. But competitions in the last couple of hours with, you got I think it was a Rolex, the highest percentage over target for the year, because everyone's targets were different depending on what products you were selling within the range. And the same person won it every year that I was there. And clearly it was a motivate. Well, I was motivated for about a month, and then I thought, well, I could just work the same as what I'm doing and just buy a Rolex, and it makes the motivation disappears. Not that I've got a Rolex, but that kind of I talked myself out of being in the running for it. And so it was almost demotivating in that I knew that I wasn't going to win it because the playing field, and I imagine this is similar in most companies, you have your A, B, C players. I was always a top 10, 15%er, and I never got into that top 1 or 2%. For a number of reasons that I've talked about on the show before. One was I'd never hustled as hard as what they did. and I wasn't as committed to the company as what they were. A lot of the top 1%ers have been at the company for 10, 15 years. So they just knew their customer base far better than what I could have ever known it within 2 or 3. But what I want to ask you is, with this gamification, with rewarding people for doing the things that work at the bottom of the sales funnel and allowing them perhaps to see what other people are doing so they can compare and contrast, have you found, and I don't know if there's data for this either, but have you found that the spread of how successful the salespeople are within the organization, does that spread collapse, and do you have a less of a gap between the top and the bottom after going through these kind of processes?
And this is really interesting. This is one of the core things that we sort of spend time thinking about, because you mentioned before that most teams have A, B, and C players. And it's shaped as a traditional sort of curve. So you have a few A players, you have a few C players, and you have a lot of B players. Most teams are made up of, I think it's 60% B players, or average performance, mediocre performance, whatever. And when I say average, it doesn't mean they're failing. Sometimes they hit, sometimes they don't, but they're very much in that sort of average bracket. And I think, like you said, when most companies run competitions, whether they know it or not, they've already handed the prize to the A players, simply because of the sort of the rules that we use, percentage to budget, or straight revenue, or whatever it might be. And I think the big problem here is that A players are A players irregardless of your sort of management or coaching initiatives. A players are obviously extremely committed, extremely talented, and extremely good at sales, simply. I think C players are actually never going to crack it. But what happens is sales leaders spend all their time praising and dishing out sort of recognition and love on the A players that don't need it. They spend all their time coaching the C players who are never going to make it, and they forget the big group of Bs in the middle. So what happens is, in most teams, is the B players are often like the forgotten masses, but all the potential for growth is in the B players, because they can do it. They have the talent, they have the skills, but they're underappreciated, they're underengaged, and they're undermotivated because they're forgotten. You spend all your time crisis management at the bottom, and you spend all your time, dishing out Rolexes and salesperson of the month, plaques to the A players. So what we do with our platform, to answer the question, is that by using these other metrics, so instead of saying, you get a Rolex if you for the person that goes above their target, what we actually say is that we have a scorecard. Calls, meetings, deals, all of these things are a part of it, and the person with the most points at the end of the year gets the Rolex. That changes everything, because suddenly what happens? Anyone can win. Genuinely, anyone can pick up the phone the most times. Doesn't matter if you're the best or the worst sales rep. That's a completely controllable behavior. We have to understand in sales that there are always going to be people better than us. There are always going to be these natural mavericks. They just understand how to work with customers. They're very personable. They're very curious. They're very solution orientated, and that's fine. But most of our staff are in the middle somewhere. So again, what happens is you then enable anyone to win. And what happens to a culture when this happens is very, very positive, because the best people get defensive because they're not used to not being on the top. So they often push even harder. The people in the middle, the B players, they're often extremely motivated by this chance to suddenly, be at the top of the ladder, be at the top of the scorecard, be up on the wall. So they find sort of a new gear to move into. The C players, often nothing happens there, and that's actually something that isn't actually said enough in sales organizations. The C players are just not going to make it. So yeah, we do flatten the curve a little bit. The results don't necessarily have to change. Normally they do, because when you unlock the engagement in the B players, they often push harder, and because they have the talent there, they often perform better as well. So often we do see a little bit of a shift, and the curve starts to be sort of a little bit more slanted towards a few Bs move into the A team, which is really, really positive. But I think, the most important change that happens when you do this is that you're very clear with what you what you want people to do. You reward people for working hard, not just closing deals, which I think for the culture is great, because anyone coming in, they understand that, hey, we're rewarded here, literally in points by picking up the phone and booking meetings and closing deals as well, obviously. But you create a very sort of energized and hungry culture, which I think is really, really good. You're not just sort of like a maverick organization where you have a couple of superstars that are saving everyone every quarter, which is obviously super positive.
Love it. James, I love it. You answered a bunch more questions I was going to ask you then. And one angle I like in all of this is that I am a pretty good salesperson, not exceptional, because I've got good emotional intelligence. I'm good at asking questions. As humbly as I can say that on my own podcast, I'm good at asking questions. I seem, again, humbly, I seem to be a person that people want to hang out with, and that's helped in medical device sales, in that surgeons live up to the stereotype of being big, brass, cocky arseholes, especially the old school ones. And I was just, through nothing but luck and my upbringing and perhaps some genes that are thrown in there as well, I was just good at breaking down those alpha barriers and just having a conversation with them and talking about drinking and golf and all this stuff that doesn't mean anything but allows you to build that rapport. However, I know that I was beaten by people who just worked harder than me. And what this gamification, whether it's your platform, whether it's, there's a couple of other platforms out there as well, what I think that puts into place, I think is really valuable, and something that I clearly missed was that I wasn't able to see that these people were outworking me. And some of them were, they wouldn't admit that they were doing crazy hours to get the results that they were getting. So I'd go out, and whether I'd be out with a sales call with them or whether they'd be on a sales call with me, I would be schooling them like in person with the prospect. I know that my close percentages, even though we didn't perhaps work that way because these are longer term complex sales, so a close percentage from a phone call, it was less appropriate to these kind of interactions. But I know that my relationships were far deeper and far less of a time than what they were doing. But they would just have way more contacts, way more time just running like a headless chicken around a hospital and spending 9 till 9 in a hospital, speaking to everyone they possibly could. And I missed out on that because I didn't have any visual feedback on what they were doing. So I think that's important. I think the best way to improve as a salesperson is to have a coach. The best coach is the best salesperson within your organization to get under their wing. And this allows you to do that without hindering them. And so, James, I really enjoy it. And I've got a couple of questions for you that I ask everyone that comes on the show. So I'll run through these. And the first one is, who do you think is the world's greatest salesperson?
It's a great question. I think unfortunately we probably lost him a few years ago. I think, obviously Steve Jobs will go down as one of the great sort of marketeers or salespeople. And I think, he's probably it. I'll go with Steve Jobs. I think obviously sort of potentially a little bit cliche, but I think he definitely had that ability to sort of excite and engage and really, they were just devices. But, some of the branding and the messaging around the products, I mean, I think now we're starting to see it wane a little bit, but it was like fever pitch, wasn't it? I think, have you seen that video? I forget the guy's name. It's Steve something. And he does the why, what, how, the 3 circles. Have you seen that?
No.
I'll have to send it to you guys. Maybe we can get a link in the show notes or something.
Yeah, of course.
It's genuinely amazing, and it's very relevant for sales because, what this guy talks about is that, what Apple have done so well, and I think it came from him, was really sort of talking about why we do what we do, which is obviously really, really powerful. It could have been very easy to sort of pitch the iPod as, an MP3 player. They never did that though, obviously. They always sold it as, 10,000 songs in your pocket, your entire library in your pocket. And these might sound like simple things, but the competition was definitely not doing that. I don't know if you remember, but you remember the creative devices or, the sort of the
I always had this crappy 25 megabyte unbranded USB thing that an AA battery went in. That's all I could afford when I was a student when it came out.
Yeah. No, so I think Apple, whilst it might be a cliche answer, I think they've nailed this. They've really understood understood how to do that. What's your answer, by the way?
To the great salesperson, I flip and change when I think about this answer all the time. And right this second, to keep it relevant, I think Gary Vaynerchuk is top of the pile from, his marketing side of things is one thing and it probably isn't of interest to Sales Nation listening. But his ability to sell, his ability to hustle, his ability to, of course, he's beyond the state. He's got a whole marketing organization beneath him to put together all the content that he's putting out there. But his ability to personal brand and to come across as you might not like him, but I'm sure most people that don't like him would trust his opinion on things.
Yeah.
I think that is something that we're going to see more and more in the world of sales. I think we're going to have more sales heroes within each industry that are going to be perhaps have a team underneath them within the organization to become that thought leader. And whether they're writing content or doing video or just interviewing people within the industry, perhaps, it doesn't matter what the platform is. But I think we're going to see more of that. And I think Gary's clearly paving the way to some of this.
Yeah, no, I like that. I follow him on Snapchat and it's very entertaining.
Okay, next one. We're running out of time here.
Sure.
I want you to go deeper with this because I know you're into the psychology of motivation, clearly the psychology of sales, and all that comes down to our beliefs and what we want out of life. So going deeper than just helping your customers, what motivates you, James, to close more deals?
Yeah, no, so I mean, like I can potentially speak a little bit personally and then as a company. So the company has a mission to help salespeople reach their potential. And I think, we could have easily gone with a mission that was, to help companies increase sales. We've spoken a lot today about improving performance. But, whilst that might be sort of outcome A, I think what's outcome B and what's far more exciting is actually helping people reach their potential. We spoke a little bit about B players and turning them into A players. So that's what sort of motivates me to get our product out into the market, to be honest. I really am passionate about how do you unlock engagement in people, because I think, the numbers are horrific. I think the number is 13% of the global workforce are engaged in their jobs. And I think, sales is a job that requires 120% engagement. Otherwise, it's just too hard. So I am super excited about sort of how can I get more people to be passionate about sales? How do I get people to get excited? So that's probably from a professional perspective what motivates me to sort of close deals of our product. And then sort of from a personal perspective, I think sort of when you're building a company, and I founded this company, I think there's another level of passion that goes into sort of actually, having someone take a shot, or, take a chance on you. Because I think, when you're a small company, but, we're working with some of the biggest brands out there, working with Coca-Cola and companies like that, they're taking a chance on us. It's a total, whilst we might, we have a very credible product, we have a lot of good reference customers, still we're a 16-person organization there. I don't know, 600,000. How can they take a shot on us? And so that's what motivates me. I love that feeling of sort of winning the trust of a prospect.
Nice. That's a unique angle on it that I don't think anyone else has put across, so I appreciate that, James.
Good.
And I've got one final question for you.
Sure.
So I'm going to ask everyone that comes on the show, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at sales?
It's funny you say that. I have actually thought about this somewhat, and I think the main one is that I think to be good at sales, I think you have to be very comfortable with yourself. I think because so much of the job is about putting yourself out there, right? Whether that's picking up the phone, and calling, a C-level at a big enterprise, or, standing up on stage, or, conducting a meeting with 10 people in the room. So I think, going back, I think I would really push myself to try and develop those skills more. I think, naturally, I don't know about you, but I definitely, I haven't always enjoyed that. I haven't always enjoyed, like I am an outgoing and social person, but still, I'm not jumping at the bit to sort of go and stand on stage or, conduct a workshop or whatever. So I think if I could go back, I would have said yes to more of those opportunities, sort of developed that, and I don't know what we want to call it. Do we want to call it sort of public speaking skills? Because I think, the one thing I see now is that, you spoke very much about sort of building rapport in your job. And I think, being comfortable putting yourself out there is the best way to build rapport. And I think the best way to get comfortable with that is obviously to practice. So I think, say yes to more of those opportunities, lead more teams, stand on more stages, do more interviews, all those sorts of things. I would have done more, because now I'm playing catch up, 10 years later.
Good stuff. Well, James, with that, you've mentioned Sparta. Tell us where we can find out more about Sparta, and then where we can find out more about yourself as well.
Sure. So for anyone that's listening and is sort of thinking about, any of these challenges we've spoken about today, whether it's, measuring activities, driving engagement, definitely check us out. So it's www.spartasales.com, Sparta as in the Spartans, Sparta, spartasales.com, and go check that out. And then for me, really active on LinkedIn, so just search for James Pember. I'm sure we can get a link there in the show notes, or on Twitter I'm James E Pember as well.
Good stuff. Well, we'll link to all that in the show notes for anyone who is driving or on a treadmill at the moment. And with that, James, I appreciate your time. I appreciate that we're just about going over the time that we've got booked in the schedule. So I appreciate that, mate.
That's good. We like to chat.
And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. Much appreciated.
And there we have it. James, thank you for taking the time to come on the show. Massively appreciate it. I want to thank you, Sales Nation. As always, I say every episode, but there'd be no show without you guys and you sharing your attention with me. If you did enjoy this episode and you want to give a little back, you can leave an iTunes review over at salesman.red/iTunes. That'll give you a very quick guide showing you how to do it. It takes about 30 seconds and it means a lot to me and to the show. So with all that said, I'll speak with you all again on tomorrow's episode.